Emotional speech comprehension in children and adolescents with autism spectrum disorders, presented by Mara Godovic, Kayla Holloway, and Jolie Duzak.
What we know is that understanding emotional speech is a complex cognitive skill that involves processing input or cues from the environment and turning it into ideas that our brain understands. Emotional speech comprehension is a process that relies on various cues produced by the speaker. These cues include facial expressions, gestures, emotional prosody, and contextual cues. The cues that were focused on in this research study were emotional prosody and contextual cues. Emotional prosody is the way in which a speaker varies pitch, intensity, and rate of an utterance to indicate their emotions and feelings. Contextual cues refer to the semantic content that is being discussed.
The authors of this research study aimed to examine the emotional speech comprehension of children and adolescents with autism spectrum disorders, or ASD, specifically in multiple cue environments. The authors hypothesized that children and adolescents with ASD have difficulty with emotional speech comprehension. They think that this is the case because of difficulty inferring the speaker's intention in multiple cue environments. Multiple cue environments refer to times when both emotional prosody and contextual cues play a role in the comprehension.
The 26 participants with ASD in this study were on the upper end of the spectrum, meaning level 1 ASD. This is formally known as high-functioning autism. They were compared to a sample of 26 typically developing peers. All participants listened to 12 meaningless utterances conveying emotional prosody in a computerized paradigm. However, the participants were randomly presented with prosody as the sole cue, or prosody embedded in context. A low, monotonous fundamental frequency pattern was characteristic of the negative prosody, whereas a high, wide-range frequency pattern was used for the positive prosody. For the prosody embedded in context, the researchers used 12 stories about a cartoon duck and rabbit. There were two types of prosody embedded in context which gave conflicting cues. For each situation presented to the participants had to indicate whether the rabbit was feeling good or bad by pointing to the corresponding picture.
The authors found there was an existence of contextual bias and negative bias in the study. When the situational context differed with the prosody, all participants exhibited a tendency to rely on the context rather than emotional prosody. Although both groups exhibited this contextual bias, the bias was more evident in participants with ASD. In addition, all participants exhibited a negative bias by using negative prosody to judge the speaker's intention more than they relied on positive prosody. Lastly, the participants with ASD inferred the speaker's attention just as well when the prosody was the sole cue. However, when prosody was positive and embedded in negative context, participants with ASD exhibited an inferential processing deficit.
Past research has shown that children at age 9 rely on both situational context and emotional prosody to comprehend emotional speech, whereas adults tend to rely solely on emotional prosody. The mean age of typically developing participants in this study was just over 12 and a half. The participants used both prosody and context to infer the speaker's intention. This demonstrates that the developmental trajectory of emotional speech comprehension lasts relatively long before becoming adult-like. A negativity bias was found, meaning that participants were better at interpreting the emotional intention of the speaker when the prosody was negative than when it was positive. This is interesting because in the real world, adults demonstrate a negativity bias every day, where we tend to dwell on negative events more than positive events. This is an important finding as it is the first evidence of the existence of a negativity bias in individuals with autism. The presence of an inferential processing deficit in individuals with ASD is important when considering their speech comprehension in multiple cue environments. They may display a more severe deficit in speech comprehension in settings where they have to pay attention to multiple cues in a short period of time.
In our field of speech pathology and in regular daily life, we need to be mindful of the abilities of our communication partners to comprehend speech. This study has shown that some populations, such as individuals with ASD, may have difficulty comprehending emotional speech in multiple cue environments. Our discussion question for the class is, when was a time that your message may have come off differently than you intended it based on the way that it was expressed?
And these are our references. Thank you.